Father Gregory Pine is a Dominican priest of the province of St. Joseph in the United States. He is a professor of theology at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., where he is also a very active member of the Thomistic Institute. Father Gregory completed his doctoral studies at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland under the direction of Gilles Emery. He is the prolific author of several books, including, recently, Your Eucharistic Identity, a Sacramental Guide to the Fullness of Life. Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. And upcoming, one that I will need to read myself, Training the Tongue and Overcoming Sins of Speech. Sounds like good Lenten reading. Father Gregory is, besides being a prolific author, a well-known public speaker. He has been known to address topics both contemporary and also classical in many visits to campuses and other places across the United States and internationally. And he is, of course, very well known to many of us by his work and apostolate of evangelization on the internet. Please help me welcome Father Gregory Pine.
Father Rector, esteemed professors, brothers and sisters, thanks so much. It's a delight to be with you, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. The title of the talk, as you see, is Natural Right in the Setting of Catholic Social Teaching. And we can add for a subtitle, a protreptic for the conservative theologian. And we can add for a sub-subtitle, Convincing Myself. So the talk should last, for those who don't have the written text, the talk should last about 43 minutes. What are natural rights? Whence do they arise? How do we delimit them? Perhaps more importantly, why should we care? It's widely acknowledged in Catholic circles that natural rights, specifically subjective natural rights, have fallen on hard times. In practically every sector of society, proponents of contrary policies argue vehemently for their positions, both on the basis of rights, without irony or apparent consternation. The rights of the unborn, for instance, are routinely pitted against so-called reproductive rights, with seemingly no concern for the incommensurability of these claims. What is more, the resolution of such like exchanges almost wholly excludes substantive agreement as to the nature of what is good for man. Clearly, an appeal to rights is no guarantee of rational coherence or of political efficacy. In the present arrangement, natural right functions more after the manner of rhetorical ploy than as appeal to the order of justice. And as we lapse into a tacit despair regarding the efficacy and even veridicality of rights claims, we have grown increasingly weary and leery of their use. Contemporary theorists have supplied explanations for the current state of moral discourse. Among the most well-known is that advanced by Alistair MacIntyre at the beginning of After Virtue. May he rest in peace. On his reading, informed by the imaginative portrayal of Walter Miller, the West finds itself in the post-apocalyptic wreck of a cultural revolution. We retain some hold on the moral discourse and moral practice of our past, but in only haphazard fashion. We have faint notions as to the vocabulary we ought to employ, but no genuine sense as to the grammar within which it functions. We have lost our feel for the traditions in which morality makes reasonable sense. And so, we argue for our strongly held convictions on the basis of sub-rational or irrational attachments, albeit by a dubious appeal to reason concealing what is in fact a form of will to power. Within this setting, it falls to moral theorists to provide a speculative basis for reconstituted moral discourse and moral practice within a tradition. The alternative, it would seem, is nihilism. The task at hand will always be a recovery of sorts. For while there still may be a vibrancy to certain traditions of moral inquiry, we lack many of the organic means for the actual handing on. With the failure of many intermediate institutions, the family, the polity, and the church in many places, We cannot simply and uncomplicatedly come into possession of our reasonable birthright. That has been taken from us. Everything must be consciously and deliberately excavated from the wreck of cultural upheaval, and the risk of arbitrary or eclectic recovery is high. If not subject to the rigorous demands of truth, an indiscriminate opting for whatsoever tradition might tend only to worsen the deplorable state we are pretending to address. Typically, efforts at recovery deploy both genealogical and metaphysical strategies. If man is to be renewed in his confident access to the truth as it governs moral life, it will be by situating himself within a narrative that accounts for his present calamity, even as it furnishes resources for a more sensible future. So too, any theory worthy of appropriation entails some effort to describe what actually is, the things as they are in themselves. Pace Hume, normative claims arise organically from a descriptive basis. Clearly, the contemporary setting offers certain obstacles to these efforts. In the post-truth dispensation of fake news and alternative facts, readers and viewers evince high degrees of distrust even before the most verifiable of claims. We've grown accustomed to malarkey and poppycock. We have fallen prey to what one author calls truth indifference. We are fairly certain that our contemporaries aren't even trying to recount the facts. They're engaged in a different kind of enterprise, one more closely akin to advertising than to science, as it is envisioned by our forebears. Some of us fear further that we may be engaged in a similar endeavor. Who is to say that we're not making it up? What is truth, after all? And yet, the present time is not without its encouragements. A new generation of digital natives are coming into the practice of the faith in increasingly greater numbers, largely through an unstructured and unpoliced discourse made available on the internet. Even in this non-contextual space, the conversational tendencies of which are largely dictated by personal whim and algorithmic caprice, we are witnessing a return to tradition. In a strange turn of events, Gen Z is infinitely more open to truth claims than are millennials. While Gen Z may not find truth through millennials' preferred means of information dissemination, they are confident at some level that truth is to be found, at least for themselves, and on sufficient grounds as to constitute the basis for a better life. In the wake of a culture-wide crass skepticism has come what prescient voices of yesteryear hailed as a new sincerity. Gen Z has attuned its ear to the ring of truth. What is more, it has found that the Catholic Church's proclamation, practically alone among the speechifying of the age's hyper-decadent institutions, resounds intelligibly. Where then does rights talk feature in the present circumstances? Are rights worth recovering, or ought they to remain among the broken relics of a shattered past? Certainly, in Christian circles, we continue to hear critiques leveled against the use of rights in contemporary politics. For some, rights talk only reinforces a solipsistic or hyper-individualist freedom inimical to genuine personhood. For others, rights talk contributes to a neglect of both the natural law and prudential reasoning. For others still, rights talk is but the trope of a liberal order that in pretending to be neutral vis-a-vis the good, only inhibits man's social flourishing through the draconian enforcement of an ersatz end. I am inclined to think that there is some merit to argumentation of this sort. In contemporary political exchanges, rights are often treated as so much rhetorical ammunition to be used for swaying one's constituency irrespective of the putative referent in reality. Rights have come to mean something like what I want and what you can't or won't deny me, except at great political cost. I just wrote a little popular book about justice to appear in May. It's 38,000 words with precisely 0 footnotes. In the book, I entirely sidestep the question of subjective natural rights. My only mention of the issue is to acknowledge that rights are often invoked for self-serving ends, for buffering the self against the legitimate claims of the other and of the community. I use the concept in contradistinction to a mindset more ordered to the corporate recognition of objective right, the free assumption of responsibility, and the mature exercise of agency. We don't want victims at the end of the day. We want agents, we want free persons. That being said, I made my determination largely in terms of scope and audience. So, what if we had more than 38,000 words, and the liberty to include a few footnotes? Are human rights a necessary concept to retain as we work towards ameliorating our moral discourse and moral practice? I think that they are. Subjective rights correspond to a good in reality. They are worthy of recovery, and the effort should be undertaken. Certainly, the Church has chosen to express herself in these terms. We have reason to believe that subjective rights find their proximate juridical origin in the work of canonists, specifically the Decretus of the 12th century. Here, we have a tradition of commentary which attempted to make sense of the concrete effects of faith and sacrament in the lives of God's people. In their determination of power, delimitation of jurisdiction, and specification of sacramental efficacy, the Decretus sought, among other things, to facilitate the cogent reasoning of those vexed by difficult problems of interpretation and application, and rights served their purposes. Many identify the Second Scholasticism as a time during which subjective rights assumed a more recognizable doctrinal formulation in the Catholic theological tradition. We know further that this tradition was brought directly to bear in pastoral application. The work of theologians like De Vittori and Suarez informed missionaries in the New World seeking to address the injustices of colonial settlement. Many have heard of the work of the first friar missionaries to the island of Hispaniola. Immediately upon arrival to the New World, the friars noted the mistreatment of indigenous persons to which the encomienda system had given rise. Conscious of their evangelical mandate, they sought to address the situation. On the fourth Sunday of Advent in 1511, after a year of prayer and fasting, Anton de Montesinos addressed a congregation of encomenderos with the words of the gospel ringing in their ears. Sicut scriptum est in libera sermonum Isaei prophete, vox clamantis in deserto, parate viam Domini rectas facitis semitas eius. Montesinos then began his homily. I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, and therefore it behooves you to listen to me. Not with indifference, but with all your heart and senses, for this voice will be the strangest, the harshest and hardest, the most terrifying that you have ever heard or expected to hear. This voice declares that you are in mortal sin and live and die therein by reason of the cruelty and tyranny that you practice on these innocent people. Tell me, by what right, con qué derecho, or justice, do you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible slavery? By what right do you wage such detestable wars on these people? His conviction was brought to bear with an appeal to right. From canonical origins through theological formulations to pastoral applications, rights have come to occupy a place of relative importance in Catholic moral formulations. In the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church, the authority of which is admittedly circumscribed, rights are spelled out amongst the principles of Catholic social teaching. While they might not feature in the most compact list of so-called permanent principles, they appear early and often. Paragraph 152, for instance, reads, The movement towards the identification and proclamation of human rights is one of the most significant attempts to respond effectively to the inescapable demands of human dignity. The Church sees in them an opportunity, quote, for more effectively recognizing human dignity and universally promoting it as a characteristic inscribed by God the Creator in His creature, end quote. Given the place that rights have occupied in Catholic moral discourse and moral practice in the last millennium, I don't think it's overblown to claim that they feature in the Church's perennial teaching. Thus, at a time when political polarization seems to threaten the integrity of public life, now it appears to be a propitious moment for their recovery. Mind you, this call for recovery has already been taken up, and we have seen a variety of efforts at repristinating rights for Christian discourse in the past 2 generations. The genealogical efforts are well known at this point. A traditional narrative attributes the origin of subjective rights to the Franciscan school, and especially to William of Ockham. On this reading, rights talk in the Catholic tradition comes well before the quote-unquote contributions of more controversial figures like Grotius and Locke. For some, that is enough. For others, it is not. Given the suspicion with which the Franciscan tradition is viewed in certain corners of the Church, others press on further. We have seen quite a few metaphysical efforts at situating rights talk within a broader doctrinal framework. Some have found a theory of natural rights in St. Thomas Aquinas, or have shown the compatibility of his treatment of natural law and a doctrine of subjective rights. Most acknowledge that St. Thomas has a notion of objective right and not of subjective right, even as they attempt to discern the basic contours of subjective right in his account. Others have sought to root a theory of subjective rights in the doctrine of God and creation, narrative to St. Thomas. By appealing to more foundational principles, one provides more of the metaphysical picture in which rights talk makes sense and even wields a certain efficacy. It strikes me, though, that we have an opportunity to adopt a novel approach in our recovery of subjective rights, namely, within the setting of Catholic social teaching. On the one hand, it's a natural fit. Rights talk, as it is deployed in the public square, pertains to politics. Politics is classically understood as the application of ethics. Ethical reasoning, which takes its departure from revealed principles, is approximately what we mean by moral theology. And, as Catholic social teaching, qua tradition of inquiry, is a kind of moral theology, I think we have a natural or supernatural fit. But there are further reasons for which the pairing is pertinent. In the past 2 generations, we have witnessed rather violent rejections of nature and its law. One need only think of contemporary debates on human sexuality and gender to carry the point. It appears from the sociological data, though, that the advance of anti-naturalism has slowed in recent years, and even reversed course in certain sectors of society. As the world awakens from its momentary madness, the Church is in a good position to furnish an account for the recent turn of events. The Thomist might instinctually reach for natural law theory, and we have seen considerable publication on this theme in the past 2 generations. I have an article coming out in 2 months apropos thereof. It appears to me, though, that this may not be the most prudent move. For while natural law theory remains largely foreign to our secular contemporaries, natural rights appeal more readily. We can use this appeal to our advantage without losing anything of the Church's moral doctrine. Rights can serve as the precise means through which the natural law delimits the responsibility of free persons. Rights can supply a basis on which we vindicate the agency of the unborn, the immature, the infirm, the incapable, and the aged. Rights can sensitize us to a vertical analogy of claims situated within a hierarchy of person and things, read natures, that condition the lower by the higher. But if rights are to serve in this stead, I think that they need to do so within the setting of the pertinent relationships and interactions that bring their intelligibility to bear. One must conceive of the rights of a child with reference to his mother and his father, the rights of a worker with reference to his family and his company, the rights of a legislator with reference to his constituency and his God. In short, the human person and his dignity must be understood with reference to the other and the community as they relate to and interact with him in justice and charity. The culture is ready to have this conversation. The culture is ready to talk about Catholic social teaching. I recently hosted an event in the United States for which someone traveled from the Netherlands. I was astonished by this woman's willingness to come 6,000 kilometers for what amounted to a day of recollection. Naturally, I took time to speak with her and thank her. During our exchange, she asked me a simple question. What do you think are the Church's best resources in the present work of evangelization? I forgot my answer, but I probably listed my 3 favorites: Our Lord's Victory, Our Lady's Intercession, and St. Thomas's Wisdom. Irrespective of what I said, though, I recall her next words. Don't forget about Catholic social teaching. It's what got me. Her experience is not an isolated one. On every side, we witness young people of every imaginable political affiliation concerning themselves with similar objects of communal solicitude: human development, women's health, ecological stewardship. Even as political polarization distresses an increasingly partisan populace, we see an increasing number of individuals who are willing to break ranks to address urgent social issues in deference to the truth. Take one example. Clinicians have noted a higher rate of non-religious women abstaining from the use of oral contraception for reasons of health, a greater sensitivity to hormonal imbalance, uterine damage, chronic fertility issues, and even ecological impact has conservative and progressive women implementing similar practices. The Catholic Church is in a privileged position to seize this opportunity, but we must be innocent as doves and crafty as serpents. We must address our argumentation to potential converts in language that they can understand. The Femme app, for instance, is a product developed to help women track their cycle. It markets itself as promoting holistic women's health, and it does. Though developed under Catholic auspices, it works to communicate in terms of public reason, and by creating space in which for women to address symptoms and treat underlying conditions, it facilitates an encounter with the truth of their bodies, even as it removes obstacles to both conception and conversion. We sometimes forget that the church is somewhat unique in that she enunciates and implements a coherent moral discourse and moral practice when engaging the world in its different social and political dimensions. In a world where everyone cares about every issue, ranging from minimum wage to nuclear waste, I think many people find it quite astonishing that the church cares with equal intensity, though perhaps not with the same fanaticism. In effect, the church expresses concern for all creatures in the light of their Creator. This is part of how she is a light to the nations. This is part of her evangelical witness. But the church's witness is bolstered still further by the fact that she cares more about something else, that is, someone else, namely the glory of God and the salvation of souls. In the contemporary space, at the nadir of a century-long slump of secularization, politics has come to occupy the status of highest concern. With many persons and institutions almost wholly without God, our political struggles are often spurred on by a desperation proper to end times efforts. When one ceases to look beyond the city of man for redemption and deliverance, every setback or reversal registers with the tragedy of final loss. The church is uniquely suited to direct man's gaze beyond the city of man to the city of God, towards an eschatological horizon of God's choosing. This direction does not so much trivialize present efforts as invest them with the urgency of vocation and enliven them with a spirit of abandon. For in the end, we are agents of providence, not technicians of reality. If the recovery is to enjoy any modicum of success, it will have to attract adherents and practitioners of varied political persuasions, not just from outside the church, but from inside the church. In effect, we will have to overcome our own political polarization that vexes our Catholic communion. In this way, we may have something to learn from the aforementioned secular contemporaries who are willing to break ranks. It is natural in our Catholic theological, liturgical, and practical lives that we tend to form parties of a certain sort. It is also natural that we find ourselves divided from those with whom we differ on these issues. I was assigned in Switzerland for 3 years. I get it. It is not for nothing that we speak just as readily of liberal and conservative Catholics as of liberal and conservative politicians. The risk with this tendency, though, is that we end up relying upon similar strategies in Catholic circles as in political circles, specifically that we become party men and women. The language of rights is more native to a liberal political conception than to a conservative one. The suspicion with which many look on rights in conservative circles arises in part from the party spirit native to the polarized society. Because progressive theorists have flocked to rights discourse, many conservative theorists have consciously or unconsciously fled. But in doing so, they tacitly affirm a procedural priority to political discourse over moral discourse. What is more, they leave undone the moral discourse that departs from principles and proceeds by arguments and not by mere allergy. The prudent move, insofar as embodied persons are capable of it, must be to rise above the limitations of the immanent political by appeal to the transcendent moral and recognition of a possible good that impinges upon us all. Take, for example, the question of environmental rights. Traditionally, we wouldn't attribute rights to non-persons. Environmental rights, if they describe anything, describe how a person and a society ought to comport themselves in their environment given the goodness of God's creation, the limitations of human dominion, and the relative scarcity of available resources. Many of our secular contemporaries would formulate their position somewhat differently. At times, the utter lack of nuance is enough to send one running in the opposite direction, and many have done just that, retaining only enough of a recent encyclical to pronounce upon their carbon footprint as either Laudato Si or Laudato No. And yet, while we may care less about eco-justice than about Christological orthodoxy, we still care about it. And though some of our contemporaries may care a lot more about eco-justice than about Christological orthodoxy, nevertheless, our common care is a point of contact, and it may be the way of bridging our secular contemporaries to Christological orthodoxy. By leading the discourse and guiding the conversation, we can conduct those who might not otherwise interest themselves in ecclesial life through the pursuit of an integral human ecology. Catholic social teaching is the setting in which to host these types of conversations. For years, Catholic social teaching has been largely the domain of liberals. Many conservatives have shied away from the discourse for reasons of political allergy, or perhaps by a prudential judgment that it wasn't worth wading through the literature when one's time could be spent more profitably or expeditiously elsewhere. I have experienced this aversion myself. I was once I love this. I was once assigned to help with a retreat for the students of a campus ministry at a local university. My role in the day's events were wholly ancillary. I looked on as a lay pastoral associate, led the students in icebreakers and introductions for the better part of the morning. When it came time for substantive content, I watched as the students were divided into groups and given poster boards, each entitled with a different principle of Catholic social teaching. I registered dismay as they were then instructed to fill out their poster boards with the ways in which they intended to implement that principle in their lives during the school year. All I remember from their results is that one student solemnly promised to buy fair trade coffee for the rest of the year. I probably would have forgotten the experience entirely were it not for a crowning glory. As we concluded the day's events, which included no kerygma and no catechesis, the schedule called for a concluding Mass. I ambled over to the sacristy only to be told shortly thereafter that I would not be permitted to concelebrate. The sister sacristan explained that since the sisters who oversaw the retreat center weren't allowed to concelebrate, neither was I. The experience was perfect. I sat outside and read Gary de Lagrange and then celebrated the Dominican rite upon returning home. I say that not to ridicule. I say that to communicate that I understand what's at stake. I understand the Catholic social teaching is a frustrating discipline. Its preoccupation with positive precepts and apparently hortatory nature makes it feel less like science and more like paranesis. When compared to the Church's sexual teaching, which traffics quite often in negative precepts and offers clear scientific explanations, Catholic social teaching can feel unserious. But to avoid Catholic social teaching at this juncture would be a mistake for the theological guild. Now, more than ever, we need to recover moral discourse and moral practice within a setting in which we can hope to meet our secular contemporaries as they experience their moral reality. The work as outlined can be genuinely evangelical and not just vacuously ecumenical. The recovery of rights needn't culminate in a mutual expression of respectful esteem. It ought to culminate in baptism. To this end, a Catholic theologian ought to recover rights in a way that is genuinely mystagogical. Consider, for instance, where rights fit within Catholic social teaching. Lists of the most important principles of Catholic social teaching vary, but when pressed to choose four, the Church typically responds with 1, the dignity of the human person, 2, common good, 3, subsidiarity, and 4, solidarity. It's when allowed to enumerate further principles that the Church typically adds human rights. Human rights fits within a vision of life that draws in the power of these principles in their communal realization. Human rights flow from the dignity of the human person, a doctrine that the West truly and fully learned from the Church. So too, human rights flow into the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity, fostering a vision of a society constituted by cooperative agency in order to a hierarchy of goods with God at the summit. The Church is well situated to exposit this teaching and give an account for which the world is quite literally dying. At the end of the day, only the Church can be relied upon to champion these principles and advance a discourse and practice in which man's integral flourishing is prized. For while there remains a natural integrity to the doctrine of subjective rights, the persistent misuse of the past centuries has left many persons speculatively numb to the claims and practically unable to effect the recovery for themselves. I see this task as pertaining to the office of Christian instruction, or what might be specified further as teaching and preaching, a task to hold before our eyes on this Dies Academicus. In the Summa Theologiae Tertia Pars, question 71, article 4, response to the third objection, in an article dedicated to pre-baptismal catechesis, St. Thomas outlines what he understands to be 4 kinds of instruction. The first, he refers to as converting to the faith, conversiva ad fidem. We can call this apologetic and charismatic preaching. St. Thomas says that this pertains to bishops, for pseudo-Dionysian reasons, but he concedes that it can pertain to any preacher, indeed any faithful person. The second, he refers to as that by which someone is instructed in the rudiments of the faith, and especially in what one ought to have for receiving the sacraments. We can call this catechetical preaching. This, he says, pertains to the ministers, thinking especially of priests, but also of deacons, subdeacons, acolytes, etc. The third he refers to as concerning the conversation or comportment of Christian life, de Conversazione Christiane Vitae. We can call this moral preaching. This, he says, pertains to sponsors or godparents, thinking, of course, of parents as well. The fourth and final concerns what he says are the profound mysteries of the faith and the perfection of Christian life. We can call this mystagogical preaching, or even holy preaching. St. Thomas says that this pertains to bishops, but he would have probably understood the Dominican order to have a share in precisely this grace. The recovery of rights talk within the setting of Catholic social teaching pertains squarely to Christian instruction, and I think we can see elements of all four modes of teaching and preaching at work in the task. To those who would trot out past corporate abuses like the Inquisition and the Crusades as evidence of the Church's inefficacy and malignancy, we can advance an apology of her as a defender of rights, even as we proclaim a Christ who came to bestow upon us far more than our due. For those lacking the vocabulary and grammar to enunciate their commitment to human dignity, we can furnish them with a biblical and traditional catechesis as to the image of God which Christ came to restore and perfect. For those bewildered by behavioral incoherence, we can show them the way of a moral life in which each person assumes his proper place and plays his proper role in the service of a common good, more personal than his private good. And to those who think only of social and political solutions for their intractable problems, we can direct their gaze beyond strategy to salvation and to the promise of perfected agency in communion with the God who goes before us and awaits us at the end. If done well, the recovery of rights ought to facilitate an encounter between our secular contemporaries and the dignity of their human estate, for the recovery of which God himself was willing to die. In that revelation of God's life and the accompanying mediation of grace, we have abundant resources for our social and political aims, even as we pursue a goal that lies far beyond them, a goal that ranges all the way to God. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions.
So I noticed, despite the, very, I think, convincing and compelling exhortation for us to not abandon the language of rights and natural rights, I did notice that we never actually defined it. So rather than put you on the spot, let me try this one out. So here's a kind of definition or at least litmus test for a right. What do you think? X has a right to Y if and only if some community owes Y to X as a matter of distributive justice.
Ooh, nice. I don't know if I want to rule out commutative justice, insofar as
Can you give me an example of a right, a human right or a natural right or something that would be guaranteed by commutative justice?
So I think just because like certain sins against commutative justice, like killing for instance, are conceived as such, I think that impinged upon the community to preserve the life to which those individuals who constitute the community have a right, but that is brought to bear on the individual. I think the way of application is by commutative justice. I think it still has a communal referent insofar as it pertains to one as a member of a human community who, by virtue of his humanization, has a capacity for recognition of the other as bearer of said right. I just think that the point that I was trying to make is that rights claim posited into the void make very little sense, and so it becomes possible in due course to have opponents posit into the void about seemingly similar matters without any real reference to reality. And I think the reason for which is because they think not of their relationship or of their interaction as something real. And so I think that the setting of reality communicates something of the substance of reality. And so I wouldn't want to rule out community. I would just say justice at my instinctual reaction. But yes, thank you for that question. No, that's a great question. And maybe just to give further details about the example taken from the lives of those first friars in Hispaniola, they weren't effective. So we don't judge the quality of their testimony on the basis of their efficacy, at least not primarily. Secondarily, you can. Because I think if the preacher were to say, like, listen, I'll just preach to whoever shows up, and he doesn't do his due diligence when it comes to advertising and promotion, I think there's more to be said, there's more to be done. But they prayed and fasted for a year. He got up in the pulpit on the fourth Sunday of Advent. He preached as he did. And then the leaders of the community came to the door of the first convent and they said, recant, or we'll chase you from the island. And so they got back together, they prayed, and then they said, well, we don't recant. He got back up in the pulpit the next weekend and said, and again. And so I think you're right. And I think that this highlights the difference between, I made reference at a certain point in the talk between the difference, on the one hand you have agents of providence, on the other hand you have technicians of reality. I think that our social and political debates accustom us to try to pull at the levers of society or of the polity so that we can manipulate it in such a way as to produce certain effects or consequences. But I think that our goal lies way beyond that, in the sense that we can trust that God has a plan for our lives and for the lives of those with whom we share this time here on the surface of the earth, and that the plan is good, albeit mysterious. It'll only be in the general resurrection where we come to a full appreciation of what he has been doing in our corporate life and how that fits organically within the setting of his body. But I think that, like, here, I think martyrdom is a helpful analogy to bring in, not for reasons of, like we're all looking to die tomorrow, but I do think that we're all going to die on a hill, in the sense that our Lord died on a hill. We pretend to, not in the abusive sense of pretend, but we pretend to, as in claim to, be followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we should expect to die on a hill of a certain sort. And so then what are the pertinent virtues which inform the martyr's witness? St. Thomas lists them as 3: faith, charity, and fortitude. And so I think that you're right in that our faith, and specifically the testimony that we give to the things of God, furnishes our contemporaries with something of that vocabulary and grammar whereby to enunciate their desires, at the very least. It kind of furnishes them with the requisite material for what the tradition calls the pius credulitatis effectus. It's not yet faith, but they can see something there, something desirable, which motivates that assent, which then gives shape to the cogitare, because faith is always going to be mental unrest and dynamism. The question is whether you can hold fast, right? Whether we can consent to and cooperate with the grace that God gives us to hold fast. So I think that our profession, or confession as it's traditionally called, gives them access to something of that, if not in its intrinsic evidence, at least in its extrinsic evidence. And then when it comes to charity, I think this is often overdone and done in silly fashion, but I think that they should see the consistency of our love, and that it's God and neighbor, and that it's to be enunciated as just such. Because I think that, like, a problem that many conservative Christians have with liberal Christians is that they undertake their work of social justice in a way that can at times seem godless. It's almost as if we fear that God won't help, and so we need to do our best, all right? I once volunteered at a school, and the person who was in charge of the assignment of my apostolate, I don't know if the backstory is necessary, but basically, like, she was very passionate about the fact that I should contribute to the work of recycling, and then recategorizing books in the library. And I find that you can do basically everything and then append the words "at the heart of the church" or "for love of Jesus" and do it with some modicum of joy in your heart. But like there was a real resistance to me speaking about the Lord Jesus in that setting for fear of what it might entail. And so I think that there has to be a clear enunciation of I love neighbor, not just for God in the sense of like, I care about God and don't care about you, but I have to put on some kind of concern when in your company because it's part of my loving God. No, it's like because I love God, I love you all the more. Because he reveals something at your core, which I find delightful and wonderful. Like I'm not spending all of my energy trying to love you. I am in fact like loving to try because there's a certain delight to it. And then fortitude. I mean, there are various reasons for which one might withhold this testimony or shy away from this testimony. You can think about it. I often say that there's no real virtue on the internet because of the non-contextual nature of it. I don't think there's any real community on the internet, but people will quibble with me on that. So I think it's our responsibility on the internet to direct people back to sacramental encounters in which Christian life actually takes definitive shape. But I do think that a lot of people don't do things on the internet for fear of how it will be interpreted. So it's like very easy, for instance, to make a reaction video. Liberal person X said liberal thing Y. I'm not liberal person X, therefore I disagree with liberal thing Y. Idiots, right? That's like the entirety of a lot of videos. But I think that the preacher can say, okay, what's at stake? What does he or she care about? Even if we might disagree with the various ways in which he goes about pursuing this course of action, what does he care about? And then furnish principles, and then furnish arguments, and reattune them to what's genuinely, shared, I suppose. And I think it takes real courage to do that because people don't really like subtlety. Because it takes time and requires effort. So yes, thank you for your question.